This is the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We chat about software development for mobile, HDTV, wearables, robotics, user experience, mentoring, and everything related to building products and services for the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Your hosts today are myself, Eric Isaacson, UX engineer at 3Pillar Global, and Danny Blue from Deloitte Digital, front-end developer over there. And we have today our guests, Steve Faulkner from the Paciello group and Marcy Sutton from Substantial. So let's start off with you, Marcy. You've been doing some really interesting stuff with JavaScript MVC, Shadow DOM, and dealing with web components and accessibility. Can you talk a little to that?
Yeah, well, in my day job, I actually don't. I add accessibility to every project I work on, but I don't work at what you call an accessibility shop. So in my free time, have been doing a lot of research. Started off with Shadow DOM. I began researching that last fall. After hearing a talk, it kind of kicked around in my head for a few years. I heard about Shadow DOM, and I always wondered what the accessibility situation was. And I had some curiosity and some time, and I started doing some research in screen readers and reading more about how browsers work. And so that turned into something that ended up being really interesting. I didn't know that it was going to be that interesting when I started, but through that research, I learned so much about how the DOM works and what front-end development is really about, how to make semantic HTML that works. So it's turned into something really cool, and I'm branching out into different topics. The MVC talk came after web components, but there's some common threads that I've been able to help talk to people about. Like this weekend at Cascadia.js, I was able to say why I think it's okay to require JavaScript, which I'm sure came as good news at a JavaScript conference, to hear in the context of accessibility why JavaScript can be required. If you want to know why, it's because the page is encountered in a screen reader after rendering. So JavaScript and CSS have already done their thing by the time the screen reader. It gets one complete tree to read aloud, which that whole process is where my research went, and I thought it was super interesting.
That's great to know, like as far as the rendering and when that happens. I know you researched a lot of how the browsers work from those talks as well, and how they render this stuff. And in your web components talk, you talked about a little bit about decorators and what you hope that they would become, because right now it's just almost a finalized spec from my understanding, but it's not implemented in any of the browsers currently. I think Bosonic might have a polyfill for it, but I haven't played with it yet. But I guess my point would be, how do you think that this would be impacted? Do you think it would be the same as JavaScript, where it's rendered before and you'd be able to parse ARIA attributes and things on that, or something else?
I have no idea. That one is so crazy. So the idea with decorators is that, at least from what I read, is that you could include a snippet of HTML in your CSS the same way that you would link a background image. And so you would be able to decorate HTML for presentation purposes. Somebody pointed out to me that is a huge security risk, letting people do that. So I'm really curious what's going to happen with that. Decorators. No idea. But it would be a good research opportunity, so we'll find out.
You know, that was my immediate thought when I saw, wow, you can inject templates through CSS, was, wow, this is a high security risk. And for those who don't know what it is the web components consist of 4 major specs: templates, the custom elements, the Shadow DOM, and HTML imports. But there's also a 5th spec, which is not implemented in any of the browsers, as I said, called decorators, which takes CSS and similar to the content rule, but you'll actually apply an entire HTML markup template instead of just text, which is really useful in a lot of cases, but does pose some security issues. So I'm really curious to see how the browser implementers will work with this.
Yeah, me too. And also the fact that it's for presentation. I'm curious that one of the things with accessibility is always the worry that people will be lazy. And I feel like if it's said that it's for presentation only, people might, I don't know. I have no idea how a screen reader is going to interact with a decorator.
Yeah, it really depends on how it is implemented. Absolutely.
The cool thing about the stuff, I used to just kind of not care about, specs that are so far out that you can't possibly use them right now. Well, I learned over time that the difference in getting into that stuff early is that if it needs to be improved, we can actually, get involved and try to improve these specs as they're developing.
Have you worked on that spec at all, or do you know kind of what we may expect with some of the accessibility on that?
I haven't worked on decorators. One of the things that I was going to say, but I've been following the spec development. That my understanding is decorators is going nowhere fast as far as implementation is concerned, and there's still quite a bit of instability or discussion going on around the implementation of the different parts of the web components, Shadow DOM and custom elements, etc. So, because at one point the decorators was, a fully fledged part of what Google in particular were pushing, and then it got dropped away. So, who knows? I've just seen concerns raised by various implementers such as WebKit in regards to this, and unfortunately, unless you get you get buy-in from a number of implementers, it's just not going to happen. Well, it's not going to happen in a way that is provides interoperable, development and use on the web.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it might just go away, the entire spec?
I don't know about that. I think that it would probably be changed substantially before it reaches maturity.
The highest concern would be the security, right, of how that gets implemented because of the markup injections.
Yeah, I'm unsure about that. But yeah, that's why I heard Marcy saying. I haven't looked at decorators a huge amount myself. I think that there's lots of concerns around the way the architecture of web components in general, or there are some concerns around those things, and decorators in particular. That's as deep as my knowledge goes about this. I mean, I've been following the web components because it's for a while, because it's an interesting aspect in regards to accessibility, and so I sort of keep on an interest. I keep an eye on it at that level, looking at how we can implement accessibility. But in a lot of senses, to me, that web components are just another method of providing custom components that that we've already had for years anyway. So there are some extra issues around the Shadow DOM, etc. But it's still basically people building stuff out of HTML component, basic HTML features, and how do we add the missing semantics in and the interaction behaviors into those things, which is like something like jQuery or some similar sort of issues.
I find that when I talk with developers about accessibility, and even in business, it's sort of a, it's not a high priority. It's always put on the bottom, right? So like, it'll be, we'll just retrofit that later, and it'll be okay, and it'll just take like, a whole bunch of tech debt to fix this, and oh my God, we got to go to WebAIM and figure out what we need to implement for 508 compliance. And the more I work with accessibility, the more I realize that all of these are sort of unsubstantiated. So what do you guys think about that sort of mindset that developers tend to have?
You know what I always ask people when they say that? Well, are you going to retrofit mobile too? Because you know how painful that is, and it's pretty much the same situation.
Good times.
Because technical debt, I think, can make that pretty difficult. It also, chances are you're not developing an accessible user experience. So yeah, the way we wire it together, there's a lot to do with that, but there's just simple stuff like brand colors and I don't know, the way you interact with a web application that need to be thought of earlier. So if you're saying we're going to retrofit that, it's like that's going to probably be a pretty garbage experience.
Yeah, one of the arguments is, oh, well, it's only a small percentage of our user base.
Yeah, it's bigger than you would think. I usually play up the emotional argument. Speaking at conferences, I don't want to be like a downer about it, so I try to take kind of the inspirational angle and the it's the right thing to do angle, but I don't know how effective that would be with people just flat out telling me that it's, I don't know, too small of their audience and they have numbers to back it up, or I don't even know how you would. Yeah. I think there's, different ways to argue the importance of accessibility. I personally take one angle at it. I'd be curious, Steve, to hear how you would handle that to get people who don't see the value in it to really come around.
I take many routes. Most of them are sort of beating people around the head. Unfortunately, that's why I consider myself to be an accessibility curmudgeon. But
whatever you got to do.
Well, it's we're talking about different things that I do this. It's my job and my day-to-day job where I'm dealing with clients that have come to us because they need to get something fixed, or they want to build their application or site or whatever it is to be accessible. It's always better, obviously, if we can work with those clients from the start of a project. It's always a hassle, and it's always a second-rate solution when you have to add stuff on at the end.
Steve, do you find that clients come to you more often after the fact?
Yeah, a good percentage of the clients come to us because, and a good percentage of the clients we deal with mostly stateside clients, and a good percentage of these clients are coming to us because they are trying to sell into US federal government, for example, and they will. There's the Section 508 standards, and those standards, their procurement standards, and the federal government departments will say, well, I'm going to buy. We need to have an accessible product in order for us to buy it, or if there's an accessible product and a non-accessible product, we're more likely to buy the accessible product. And so there's an economic incentive for vendors to actually produce, products that are compliant with the standards. But being compliant with the standards doesn't always mean that the products are accessible, but they're more accessible than they would be otherwise. But it's always it's usually a situation where they have a pre-existing product. They're trying to get the federal government or state governments to buy the product, and they've claimed a certain level of compliance. When it gets tested by the state government or the federal government, they find that it doesn't come up to par, and so they come to us to try to help them to get it to a point where it's acceptable as a viable product to buy.
And that's kind of interesting. What you said about people not actually hitting these metrics in terms of what is actually compliant. So how do you approach it, either with clients or developers, to take something past the checking the box? Beyond just checking the box, the little check mark on the back of the box to say yes, this meets this certain standard, to take it from that to actually being a well-designed experience.
In essence, that the standards, the old 508 standards, don't really cut it as far as providing an accessible experience. But it's also that you have to look at the usability aspects of it as well. So you can have it in compliance, but it's almost unusable. But what you will find usually is that a product that is a usability dog will also be an accessibility dog, and vice versa, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's all about is that a lot of the front end stuff, and this is what, in my experience, a lot of the front end of of applications that, and what I'm generally talking about, I'm talking about intranet-based applications that aren't generally served openly on the web, but they're using the internet in order to provide access to it, or the web to provide access to it through company-wide or whatever. Is that these applications have been built by back-end engineers, and the output of the front end is just through WYSIWYG or some semi-automated process that of the particular development environment they're using, and they have no understanding of HTML, or limited understanding of HTML and how to make it usable or accessible.
Yeah, I found that with developers, they'll just oh, accessibility, I'll just copy paste some Bootstrap code here and put that in there, and they don't understand like what they're doing, and they could really do more harm than good if they don't understand the semantics, keyboard access, why you would do these things.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we find quite often as well, is that people will add something like ARIA, but they won't understand how it actually works. And they'll end up just making it worse, or still, it doesn't help. What I think the importance of is having if you are using ARIA or whatever development environment you use, whatever library you're using, is having the stuff built into the library, and so it's a step away from using a native control. If you use an HTML button, you've got all things built in, you're pretty good to go. If you use a button from a library that has built the accessibility in already, then you're still good to go. You shouldn't have to add stuff in yourself. And that's why it's important to actually get the libraries to actually implement this stuff. I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, I was talking about being curmudgeon before, but I have been keeping an eye on web components, and Google, has been pushing web components a lot, and they have been providing examples and demos and for developers to play with, and all those demos and examples pretty much have been devoid of any accessibility. They haven't been built with accessibility in mind, and then they say, oh, well, it's just a demo. Yeah, it's just a demo that hundreds of thousands of developers look at and learn from. And so I mean, that's why I get, because but at the same time I try to put my money where my mouth is and develop examples of web components and other components that and custom controls that actually, well, here you are, it can be done. And it's best, especially where you've got a large company with obviously lots of talent, lots of resources. If they're pushing this is a new platform, then they should be, from the start, they should be sticking this stuff in there. And so that if it's reused, it's the accessibility, usability is already built in. And B, if it's looked at, which it obviously is, and copied, that people will see that this is a part of, this is an integral part of what the components are and what they need to include.
It's kind of the same story with the MVC frameworks. So actually my next project is going to be an accessibility project. I don't know how much I can say about that, but I'm going to be helping one of the kind of bigger JavaScript frameworks identify what accessibility they could add into the framework and how they can document that. So along in the docs for this framework, which I'm not going to say which one, they are hoping to get some information in the docs that maybe there'd be an aside if you're, implementing some kind of component in this framework, to say, hey, you should also read this thing about accessibility. So I wish that kind of stuff came earlier, but I'm glad that they're thinking about it. Because, they put demos out in front of a lot of eyeballs that are not fully baked. And people want to pick that up and start using it because it's a cool kid on the block. Material design came out, and people jump on those bandwagons very fast. So if the demos aren't accessible from the beginning, we're setting a bad example. It's kind of irresponsible, if you ask me. But as long as they fix them eventually, I think that's good. But we're still not teaching people the right way to do something.
It's a great point, Marcy, and I think that developers care and they want to do the right thing, but they don't necessarily know where to go to find the developer resources, and sometimes they're blocked at a higher level. Like, well, that's not important for our project right now, which we talked about earlier. But in building JavaScript MV star heavy client apps, I mean, developers, at least I do, tend to look for examples that we can implement and modify as we need. And we look to our docs, we look to frameworks, we look to GitHub, we look to CodePen, or wherever we can find workable code examples that we can play with and learn from and then implement. So, I mean, stuff like WebAIM and W3C specs are very valuable and they have good information, but they're very hard to read for web developers. And that's mostly because they aren't really made for developer consumption. So what resources are out there that web developers can use that provide useful code examples, toolchain setup information, best practices for developing with ARIA, as far as code and development goes?
You could answer that, Marcy?
I think this is kind of a gap. I think we don't really have a good place to look for examples. And when I get out there and talk about ARIA, what I hear a lot is pretty much that same thing, that, the spec's really verbose and it's not very, developer friendly, surprisingly. And I remember that from my own experience. I did not dive into ARIA right away because I was working on the Target account at an agency that I worked at, Pop. And that's where I got into accessibility. But when I started adding a little bit of ARIA, I wasn't totally sure how it worked. And I did that thing where you make it worse than it could be by misusing it. And so I stopped using ARIA. I just tried to make it work with native controls. And if I needed to use JavaScript, I could get pretty far because I wasn't creating anything that custom. But I learned that you have to use ARIA responsibly. So having gone through that myself, I can definitely see how developers aren't informed of how ARIA works. So I think having a place where good examples can be showcased, that's something we desperately need.
Yeah, I suppose I can chime in. I agree with Marcy that there's that, like most specs, that say, if you look at we were talking about web components spec before. If you try to read the web component specs, it's pretty difficult and very dense, and to create even a simple web component from those specs, which I did try to do, but I ended up waiting until some other people that understood things could provide them for me, because I was unable to do it myself. But that's the way. But the thing, I suppose, to understand about specifications is that the audience is not developers. They're not written for developers. They're written for implementers, and to varying degrees that there may be some developer-related advice in those specs, but that's a secondary matter. Mm-hmm. That this is something that I've thought about a lot, and that one of the things that I've been working on with the HTML spec, as most people know, there's two HTML specifications. There's one at WhatWG, there's one at the W3C, and the W3C draws in a lot of the implementation stuff from the WhatWG spec, but at the same time, what I've been trying to do is add extra informative information into the HTML spec to make it provide better, more up-to-date information for developers about how to use and when to use particular features. For example, there's been a lot of ongoing discussion about the use of heading structures within HTML, and how the new HTML5 outline structure provides the sort of holy grail of no longer needing to use H1 to H6, but that unfortunately that it's like that something in the spec is in a spec is a fiction until it becomes an implementation reality, and this aspect, for example, of the outline algorithm is still a fiction. And so even though the specs gives you advice on what a wonderful thing the document outline is, it doesn't actually translate for users, specifically users with AT, who rely upon the document outline to be able to, or the structure within HTML document to be able to understand the content relationships.
AT meaning assistive technology, right?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, this is technology. And so one of the things that I've been doing with the HTML spec at W3C is adding extra information in there to say, hey, this, be aware that this thing does not do in reality what it says on the box. And also, I mean, apart from those just adding that information into developers, I also been working with the AT vendors and the accessibility engineers at the various browser companies to get stuff implemented, and so it does become a reality, or at least in the case of the document outline, trying to get an understanding of why they're not going to implement it, because in theory the document outline is a good thing, but as long as it remains a theory, it's not going to be any good for anyone.
There's a running joke amongst agencies that things like mobile and accessibility will be done in, quote, the next phase.
Yeah.
Always the next phase. Like, if you drop that and people are... I'm actually a part of a Facebook group called Irate Nerd Group, and I usually go there to complain about some div button, or, I don't know, when people are being jerks out there in our day jobs. You can go to Irate Nerd Group on Facebook and complain about it, but not too much because it's public and people will see what you're complaining about. But I said something about they'll do it in the next phase, and they were like, no, literally that's what they said, was that accessibility would be in the next phase.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, it's gone now. No, it hasn't gone. The thing you need to understand about semantics, code to that, and but when they code to what this theoretical semantic structure, they're not actually providing a realistic semantic structure to end users who rely upon it.
Well, and then what about assistive technologies? Developers may or may not use that, so if it doesn't become mainstream enough, I mean, it seems like assistive technologies have to, over time, be changed to handle that kind of stuff. And if that doesn't ever become standard, I don't know how assistive technology would handle the heading outline either. You guys know anything about that?
Well, the thing is that my view is that there's a relationship between it's like a contract between developers, browser manufacturers, browser vendors, and assist technology vendors. Is that the browser developers or the browser implementers need to implement what's in the specification as regards the accessibility layer is concerned, and so the mappings from the HTML to the various accessibility APIs, and then once that's done, then the assist technology have that information. So they have, because you have the DOM tree as you were talking about before. You have the accessibility tree, which is based on the DOM tree, but it's the accessibility layer information, which is which is the tree that contains that extra semantic information, and that's provided by the browser looking at the DOM and their mappings to the various role states and properties, the accessibility states and properties. Once you have that information, then the assist technology can access it.
So in the case of the heading algorithm, I guess that's just confusing whether or not you're using assistive technology. To know, like if you're using different heading levels and you have H1s that start over, how does that affect your heading browsing experience, or does it at all?
Yeah, well, that's the issue. The issue being is where because the the accessibility layer of the headings, the heading level is not implemented in browsers into the accessibility layer, that's where you get the issue. So you get you just get a flat document structure if you're using all H1s, because the assistive technology just sees the H1, treats it as a H1, and so you just get flat document structures.
Isn't that what the Famous framework does? There's a framework called Famous.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that in the name of performance, they just flatten out the DOM tree.
Well, they flatten out the DOM tree completely, don't they?
Yeah.
They don't use, yeah.
But actually, I had a guy come up to me at Cascadia JS that works at Famous, and he said, "This is great because this is ammunition. I can take this to my leadership at Famous and say, see, people are talking about us. We have to do something about accessibility." And I threw my hands up in the air and cheered because that is the coolest thing.
So with the move to SPA applications, meaning single-page applications, we have a lot of heavy JavaScript, a lot of interaction, a lot of AJAX, a lot of things just going back and forth and changing and changing. So how do we use ARIA to better handle the accessibility of this so that we can make sure that everyone is having a great experience?
In single-page apps specifically, I guess I could talk to some of the challenges I found in working on single-page apps. Making things interactive when you're using custom controls, which is the same problem in web components actually, is that if you're creating a new custom control, you have to add tab index if it needs to be interactive. You have to give it a role. If there's a role already for that type of a control, then adding an ARIA role can help, but if you also start with native controls, it just depends whether are you implementing just like stylized versions of controls that already exist, or are you completely creating new UIs? Typically for some of these things, it'll be like a widget, and maybe the wrapping element is a custom element, but there's probably things inside of that use native controls. It's usually like wiring controls to the things that they actually affect, like telling assistive technology that those are related and one controls the other. So interactivity was a huge thing. Quickly, the update notification. When I was working on Backbone apps, and maybe you'd filter a list of something, and you type into an input field for an autocomplete or some kind of like asynchronous editing of content or filtering. If you're typing in an input control and you have things happening elsewhere on the screen, if you couldn't see the screen, you would have no idea those things were happening. So we need ways in single-page apps to notify the user that things are changing. I found that ARIA live regions worked really well for that, but there are specific cases that live regions were made for, where in a single-page app, maybe focus management is the thing you need, where rather than dumping a bunch of messages, excuse me, rather than dumping a bunch of messages into the live region, maybe it makes more sense to control their keyboard focus. So those are kind of the main areas that I've gotten into with single-page apps.
Yeah, and to your point, if some part of the page is removed altogether that had focus, then you end up in this limbo state, right? So then
Freakout Mode.
You have to come up with a way to watch the state of that focus.
Yeah, the big thing I found, depending on the way that it's templated, and this is stuff I want to look into more with React, because they have a totally different approach to rendering. But if you are, say you're like, if you hit your arrow keys to reorder a list of items or something, in the templating framework I was using on a project, it would actually rip the DOM out and put it back every time it would update. And that seems pretty common, is with client-side view rendering, it will actually replace a whole section of the web page. If your focus was on something that's getting replaced, your focus is thrown back to the top of the page in what's called freakout mode. And so that we have to handle with JavaScript. Just with a little bit of thinking, how do I wire whatever was in the DOM before it got replaced with what showed up after? Like, how do I send focus to that new content? So yeah, we need to do more of that stuff.
There's a couple of documents talking about ARIA that are, well, there's one ARIA document which is the WAI ARIA authoring practices, and it is a document that is designed for developers, and it goes through a lot of the major concepts within ARIA and how to implement it. I'm not saying it's a perfect document, but it's a good start for a better understanding how to use ARIA for many aspects, for keyboard navigation, for the correct use of role states and properties, etc. So that's one I'd be looking at. And the other would be, of course, the using ARIA in HTML, which is one of the docs that I edit, which is again is a document that it's sort of like a companion to the HTML spec, which provides a range of information about, including some rules of ARIA, which I dropped that link in the side there, which just talks about the first rule of ARIA is if you can use a native HTML element or attribute already built in, then do so. So it's these sort of basic rules for developers to follow. Not that they do, but that they should. So yeah, I just wanted to mention those documents, because there are documents out there, but like anything, it's finding, and there are good example of various libraries that provide ARIA built-in and provide accessibility built-in. So, but it's like anything, it's like finding a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, and we can post those links in the show notes as well. So anybody else that's looking for that stuff can find exactly what you're talking about.
Cool.
So it's w3c.github.io/aria-in-html, all lowercase.
Yeah, and that was just to a particular part of it. So yeah, you're also talking about techniques for providing for alt, and one of the things that I've been working on as well, as far as developers for the last couple of years, is documentation for understanding how to use providing text alternatives in HTML.
I glanced through the ARIA doc a little bit because I'm in the same boat as you. I haven't used it a lot. I'm actually pretty pleased with myself that I seem to follow the first rule pretty well. I did not know it was the first rule of ARIA, but
is it don't talk about ARIA?
Well,
yeah. If you can use a native HTML element or attribute with the semantics and behavior you require already built in, instead of repurposing an element and adding an ARIA role, state, or property to make it accessible, then do so.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It actually seems like a no-brainer, but I guess it really is easy to just kind of Frankenstein buttons together or things like that. But almost seems easier to make it to do it that way, less for you to have to manage.
I was looking for I think it was an image slideshow. I was looking for scripts so that we didn't have to rewrite every single thing on a project that had kind of a compressed deadline. And in picking it was a carousel, I went and it helped. Thankfully, you can go and look on GitHub and see, are there a bunch of issues open against this thing? What's the accessibility? I usually go on GitHub when I pick a framework and go and search their issues and see if people are calling out accessibility. And if they are, how the people respond to it. And there was this one carousel I went and looked up accessibility, and I found this guy saying that he chose divs because anchors are too hard to restyle. Like, I had styles that I have to override, so I'm not going to use an anchor it was for the arrows of the carousel. And some guy, I was like, my blood was boiling. Like, I was reading, and like, my blood I'm just like starting to get mad reading this guy's response. Why he's too late, can't be bothered to override the style of a link. And somebody had already come on to this carousel issue on GitHub and just like laid into this guy and said, that is so wrong. Here's some documentation why. Here's how you could do that better. And by the way, that should be a button element, not an anchor. It was awesome. I already laid the smack down. I didn't have to do it.
That's right. It's nice. It's nice when you read something with somebody that already has your thoughts.
No, it's awesome to see that other people also care about accessibility, because it seems like so many people just don't care about it.
It's really easy to overlook.
Yeah.
Yes.
What made the difference for me was actually meeting people with disabilities, and especially with visual disabilities, because whenever I share anything on Facebook or Twitter, I, in my mind, go, are my blind friends going to be able to see this thing? And even if it's a website that I didn't create, if it's, you know, a goofy image with text in it, or just something that I think is funny. Someone told me once that you're leaving people out of a joke. And I take that kind of personally. Like, I want to be a good communicator, and I want my friends to know that I'm thinking about them. And if they can't see things that I'm sharing, then they're going to be left out of the joke. So I am thinking about accessibility all the time for that reason.
Marcy, you did a great talk at JSConf this year called Accessibility of Web Components. And in that talk, you talked about the Shadow DOM in particular, and you had some great examples in there. For those who don't know, the Shadow DOM is one of the web component specs that works similar to a document fragment, where it's a isolated subtree of the DOM. So all of the elements that are inside of that shadow root are not exposed to the actual parent document, which is very, very powerful and something we've desperately needed on the front end for a while. It is not pure encapsulation because you can break it, but the accessibility of it has been not really talked about so much until your talk came around and you exposed a lot of the details of that.
Well, when I got into doing Shadow DOM research, I just created some vanilla Shadow DOM. Like, I created some Shadow DOMs. I wanted to try it only in the newest browsers that supported it, so I didn't have to use, huge polyfill libraries. In my examples, I ended up using Polymer's shim. I think it's called platform.js. It's not the part that provides you a bunch of the web components to start with. It purely just kind of smooths out the implementation to a broader set of browsers.
Just the Polymer part.
Yeah, the platform part. And so I created some components, and then I just went and tested them in screen readers. And the screen reader went right through the boundary. And it was kind of anticlimactic. Like, I built it up to be this huge thing. And then when it ended up just working, I was pretty surprised. And I was like, man, this seems so obvious to me now that this would work. And I almost gave up on that research. I almost didn't continue with it because I thought it was so dead obvious that everybody knew. But then I remembered how little I knew before I did that research and how big of a question I had about it. I knew that there were going to be other people with that question, so I kept going with the research. But it was surprisingly easy because, as we talked about this a little earlier, a screen reader encounters a web page as rendered. So after your views have been appended, or custom elements have been injected with JavaScript or whatnot, your screen reader is going to encounter it after that. So that's why it's actually accessible. I just wasn't sure if at an early point in developing of web components, if I was going to have to go and bug browser implementers to improve their implementations. But as far as I found, they were pretty good.
That's pretty cool. Do you have do you have articles or something about that particular research that people could go and look at?
I do. Yeah, I'll post a link on my company blog. That's where my research originally went.
Okay.
So I try to make my talks really fun. I'm doing one at JSConf EU in Berlin in September, and I'm already scheming what I'm going to put in there. It's probably going to be a German sparkle party. don't know if you're familiar with that video. My bike racing friends were like, "You have to do it. You have to talk about the German Sparkle Party." I might wear sparkles. I don't know.
I would go with the sparkles.
Yeah. Whatever gets people to be like, "Whoa, this is not a boring accessibility talk." All right.
Accessibility is awesome.
It is awesome.
Danny and I have been working a lot with Polymer and web components for prototyping and all sorts of stuff. And he's actually running a hangout tomorrow night on just the communication techniques. So one of the things I encountered when I was building a particular prototype was I ended up having one component, and inside that component I was nesting. I almost had 4 levels deep, which is probably a bad idea, but I think it'd be interesting to test the screen readers with multiple levels of shadow DOM.
I mean, theoretically, that just should work. But if it's encapsulated and you're keeping scripts and styles, contained in a certain part of the DOM, how is the screen reader going to handle that? I think unless it affects the accessibility tree, it should be pretty seamless. Like if you have display none on something, that will keep it from being added to the accessibility tree. The part I know Steve has done a little research on that's still weird is like using ID selectors in encapsulated stuff. Like the ID shouldn't, it should be encapsulated so that the content inside of the web component knows nothing about the outside and vice versa. From the top down, like maybe as the owner of the web page, you have a backdoor into the web component using special ways of getting past encapsulation. I know that the way that you do that has changed since I started my research, but
so does it break because of the IDs if they're duplicate IDs or something?
Potentially, or it just doesn't work. And things like ARIA active descendant, I think that there's definitely some weird quirks around stuff like that.
I mean, when I was going through the web components the first time, I was lucky to come across Rob Dotson's the web component sketchbook. So it was a repository he just did to research building native web components. And so I don't know. Did you find that stuff, or did you just start from scratch and be like, I'm going to build this?
I started from scratch, but I found his stuff probably around December, maybe. I remember I was like tweeting at him, going, "Oh my God, this is so cool! Have you thought about accessibility?" And he was like, "No, not really." And that was like right before he got hired at Google. Because I remember, I was like, "Man, that guy's living a dream now. That's so cool."
He definitely emphasized that the most recent release would have accessibility built in. I think it does.
Yeah, he's been working with Alice Boxhall. She's a accessibility-focused engineer at Google. She works on the accessibility developer tools. And I've seen her and Rob Dodson talking on GitHub about how to add accessibility to things like an icon web component.
Right.
Talked a lot about, it's an image role. Can we use the alt attribute, or is that confusing because it's not really an image? So it's definitely, they've been working on it. It's pretty cool.
As far as like templates go, using the template tag with web components, and even in MV star frameworks like I guess ng includes. Yeah. Like, did you find any issues with those?
With templates, as far as, I mean, I haven't really, the focus management is definitely the biggest thing. Like if you're appending and removing parts of the DOM, handling focus is one of the bigger problems. But in terms of like selectors or, I don't know, anything related to encapsulation, I haven't continued doing research on that, but yeah, I kind of moved on to the MVC framework stuff and didn't focus as much on Shadow DOM. But it's cool that there's some overlap. Like I know in Ember, they have custom components that are pretty forward-thinking in that, like they are kind of shimming in support in Ember, and as web components become more standard, they'll kind of like change their implementation. so that through using their framework, it's all kind of just wrapped together. And I am honestly curious if Angular and Polymer will end up becoming a single thing.
Polymer elements and Angular directives feel very, very similar. And I know there's been a lot of people have started looking at trying to, I don't know if a lot of people, but taking these smaller like Angular directives that they built for UI components or things like that and porting them over into web components, whether it's Polymer or something else.
Yeah, totally. And there's definitely some similar issues with both of those. Like if you're creating a custom element, it's going to have no semantic meaning unless you add semantics. And so trying to remind people about that. Otherwise, we're going to make div soup across the whole web. It'll be really modern div soup, but it's not going to tell anybody, what is this web component?
So do you think that Ember's implementation of components is maybe, I don't know if maybe a little bit more advanced than is compared to Angular directives?
I don't know. I think directives, I had a similar mental leap I had to make. I think the only difference potentially with custom components in Ember, I'm not sure if you can actually encapsulate those. But with custom components, you can basically you create a tag that you have double curly braces, the name of your component, and then closing curly braces. And Ember, you can do anything inside of that. It basically isolates a component. So the idea is encapsulation from the JavaScript side. I don't know that it actually adds a shadow DOM for like HTML encapsulation, but
I don't believe so.
But you can add the name of the tag. You can add bound attributes, so you can like play with tab index and all of those things. I did a demo with that for Cascadia.js to learn about how I can improve the accessibility of something.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and it's like you said, isolating the JavaScript is definitely one thing, because in Angular direct, you said you can isolate it in Ember and Angular directives. You have your isolated scope, and then you provide those little pipes through your attributes so that you can talk back and forth with whatever's inside.
Yep.
So keyboard access has been a big issue with a lot of these frameworks as well, from what I can see. Is there hope?
I like to think so. I try to be optimistic, just by getting out there and reminding people and teaching people how to make something interactive, like how to use tab index. When you get tab index for free, how do you make something visually interactive? I'm like the interactive person at work. I'm always saying like, this needs to be interactive, and I get resistance. Like people they want a very subtle experience, and they don't want to make it like visually interactive. And I am from the school of thought that like you have to show people where they are on the page if they aren't using a mouse. So it's a little tiring to have to always be fighting that fight for this needs to be interactive. But also, even if it's like visual interactivity is part of that, like even making it able to be focused, like that's the stuff that that I'm trying to remind people more about, is that you have to use tab index and use it responsibly. What else? Like communicating the actual role of something using ARIA.
Yeah, some of the roles I found were a little confusing, like application that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm thinking, like Angular app. All right, you're gonna make your site treated as a application, but that's not the case. There's some of them that are like obvious, like role button or role navigation. But but there's a few that are just like role documents. So what does that mean? You know what I mean? Like, so that's going back to the getting examples thing. And I think it's great that Steve put out that stuff on GitHub that has some examples there. We really need some kind of JS fiddles or something, some code pens out there.
Yeah. Well, we need like a central place to showcase really cool stuff. Because I feel like I have a bunch of examples of people who are not doing it, who are kind of failing at accessibility. Even as like virginamerica.com, for example, that's an Angular site. it got so much praise for being a, quote, slick user experience, and it's totally inaccessible. I actually heard from them that they were planning to do a separate accessibility site, and I just think that is such a fail, because I think using this new technology and innovating in the accessibility space is so much cooler than just like saying that's not our problem or whatever. I have a hard time with that, but that is an Angular application, and it could be so, like, we can make that so much better.
Did you do any web components that were based off of other components? So if you did like a button and you wired it up with the spacebar, like a regular button, right?
Yeah.
And then you made the mega button, which inherits from button. I wonder if it would actually take that functionality as well.
Possibly. Yeah, I think it probably would. The part I've run into is when I try and just create and instantiate a button element with JavaScript, because when you create a web component with Shadow DOM, you can extend other kinds of elements, but as far as I've found, you don't actually get any of the events.
And what about wiring things up? I mean, do you have to do that manually, or is that automatically happening?
Yeah, I mean, you can give something a role of button, but you also have to bind the spacebar or the enter key or whatever way people are used to using a button. If we give it a role of button and then we don't wire the spacebar, people are not going to know how to operate the thing. So it's like twofold. You have to add the role to communicate what it does and any state, things it might have going on, but then you also have to wire JavaScript events to make that a full control. It's like adding the role is only doing part of it.
So with the move to SPA applications, meaning single page applications, we have a lot of heavy JavaScript, a lot of interaction, a lot of AJAX, a lot of things just going back and forth and changing. So how do we use ARIA to better handle the accessibility of this so that we can make sure that everyone is having a great experience?
Yeah, so that is where I feel like Polymer and Angular are going to become one thing, because the data binding that Angular made popular, that's how a web component can communicate in and outside of itself. And so there seems like, and that's probably a pretty generalized way of saying that, but they seem like they really could benefit from one another. Pretty cool. I'm actually working with the Angular team to try and identify, are there any places where Angular could infer ARIA for you? Or are there defaults that maybe are like common mistakes that they can try and at least recommend to you in the documentation? But going one step further, is there any way that the framework can actually help you? Because we know that people are lazy. It's like, anything we can do to improve the accessibility situation, knowing that the majority of developers don't care, would be awesome.
It's a great point, Marcy, and I think that developers care and they want to do the right thing, but they don't necessarily know where to go to find the developer resources, and sometimes they're blocked at a higher level. Like, well, that's not important for our project right now, which we talked about earlier. But in building JavaScript MV heavy client apps, I mean, developers, at least I do, tend to look for examples that we can implement and modify as we need. And we look to our docs, we look to frameworks, we look to GitHub, we look to CodePen, or wherever we can find workable code examples that we can play with and learn from and then implement. So, I mean, stuff like WebAIM and W3C specs are very valuable and they have good information, but they're very hard to read for web developers. And that's mostly because they aren't really made for developer consumption. So what resources are out there that web developers can use that provide useful code examples, toolchain setup information, best practices for developing with ARIA, as far as code and development goes?
It would be awesome if there was a place that we could go and give praise to websites that do accessibility well. I was pushing when the NetMag awards were happening. They give awards for the best open source and the best designer of the year and all this stuff. And I had their attention enough to say, you should do an accessibility award next year. And so I'm totally going to remind them that they should award, most improved accessibility or best accessible experience or something. I think if we get things, entities like NetMag, they're out of the UK, like if we get them talking about accessibility, like all of those little things help remind people that, oh yeah, that's a thing that we need to take care of.
Yeah.
And make it cool. Make it about the good examples, not the bad examples.
Yeah, and then it's gamified too, right? Because then people,
Exactly.
I want to win it,
Yeah.
Then it becomes important to the developer at that point.
That's pretty great. But I mean, maybe if something out there doesn't exist, maybe us or maybe somebody listening needs to put this kind of thing together. Like you said, even if it's just a list, even if we can just find a list of these are good examples, or give solid code examples beyond the very, very basic, because super simple examples only work so far, and tutorials on everything have a bad tendency of going from super simple to extremely complicated with no in between step on how to handle a lot of these different things. So, like I said, it sounds like there is a gap in the in the quote unquote market for this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So anyone out there, definitely pick that one up. So if people need to contact you, Marcy, or they want to talk more about accessibility or follow you, where can they go?
Oh, my Twitter I'm pretty active on. It's a good way to reach out. It's just at Marcy Sutton, and same on GitHub. I have some, like all of my talks, all my slides are on GitHub, and then some whatever projects I have that are public facing on there as well.
Thanks a lot, Marcy, for coming on and talking to us about stuff, and it's a lot of cool stuff I hadn't thought about before, especially with the web components in terms of accessibility. So definitely a lot of cool stuff to look into.
Well, thank you, Marcy, and thanks to Steve, who had to step off early, but it was great having you both, and
Definitely.
We'll see you soon. If you'd like to follow Steve Faulkner's work, you can check him out at Steve Faulkner, all one word, SteveFaulkner. That's at Steve Faulkner on Twitter, or at Paciello Group, which is PACIELLOGROUP on Twitter as well. Also, W3C.github.io has some great resources from Steve and some other great talents as well in the accessibility field. Paciellogroup.com/blog has some information written by Steve and some other great talents from the Paciello Group worldwide. This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3 Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com.